and we are going to get started. Okay, so let's jump in since I didn't see, oh, I see a response from Kelly over here. Information tied to emotions, very good. You want to move it to long-term memory. Differences between episodic, semantic, procedural, awesome. Okay, so you really remember these pieces well. Thank you, Hassan, for that added tidbit. Really do appreciate it. We're going to go deeper this week. We're not going to get as technical as it relates to the kinds of memory. We're just going to focus on the strategies, because at the end of the day, I don't care if you call it semantic or something else. It's more about how do I get the students to remember? And it's the practical strategies that we really want to think about as we move them forward. Kelly talks about files, right? We have to file information, put it in a place where our brain can store it, and we can then go ahead and retrieve it. Okay, this makes me feel good, and I'm glad that I'm asking you a week later and you still remember it. So that means that we were somewhat effective in presenting that content, even though we were doing so, or I was doing so, with limited modalities. Didn't have the benefit of the kinesthetic component, didn't have the benefit of some of the other ways by which we kind of drive memory deeper into the recesses, or the content into the deeper recesses of our memory, our minds. But still, that was effective, and I'm glad to see that. Okay, so here are our objectives for today. I've got 12 retention strategies for you. And again, I want to clarify, when I say retention, I mean to hold on to information, which is often how we think of memory. Excuse me. But memory, we also discussed last week, was part of the way that our brain works. So it's the matter of taking in information and putting it in the right place and using it in some kind of way and figuring out where it goes and all that kind of stuff. Memory is a much more multi-layered and complex concept. Retention in many ways is more straightforward. Okay, so we're going to learn 12 retention strategies that are going to help your students hold on to information for longer so that they feel good about it, you feel good about it. Nobody wants to teach and then ask about it a week or two or three later and feel it's as if you've never taught it before. We've all been there. We've all had that experience. It is not pleasant. Kind of want to rip out your hair when that happens. And let's see what we can do about it moving forward. All right. And now I also want you to be thinking about your instruction. So maybe it's a class you delivered today or yesterday. Maybe it's something you're planning for tomorrow, but think about specific applications. As I mentioned, the strategies, as we go through them point by point, please be thinking about next steps and application for your class. I will ask you to share that with the group a little bit later. Kelly, I noticed that your chat, by the way, is to all panelists only. You probably want to adjust that. And anyone else who's set to all panelists alone, not panelists and attendees, please adjust it so that we can all see what you have to say. Okay, so how will we measure success today? The answer is really simple. List and briefly describe the 12 retention strategies. I think we're going to do a massive brain dump on the back end to try to get as many as we can in the limited time we will have at that point to do so. And I'm going to ask you to identify at least 4 applications. So I hope that you are ready. I hope you brought a notebook or something to jot notes down on, because you're going to want to be able to refer back to them during the context of this presentation. And I'm going to ask you, what's an application for a class you're going to do? And you'll say, oh, I'll do this or I'll do that. And of course, the more you have in front of you, the easier it'll be for you to not only recall it, but more importantly, to reference it and use it at the right time. Okay, so I hope that this is clear and a good starting point. If you have questions, please use the chat, preferred over Q&A, though I do check that from time to time to make sure that I'm not missing anything. All right, so I hope you are ready for the strategies. If you are ready, can you just type the word ready in the chat? Remember, I got 12 of them for you, so I really hope you brought your A game today and that you are ready to roll, because we're going to really need to process these, and I want to make sure that this is valuable to you. So thank you all for replying. Hugo and Sherry, Juanita, Hassan, Miriam, Marianne, and so many others that are replying faster than I can speak, which is pretty impressive, I think, now that I think about it. That is actually pretty impressive. Okay, so let's jump right in, and I'm going to give you the entire list first. It's not necessarily the list I would do from an intuitive standpoint, or maybe even from a sequential instructional standpoint. Can anyone think of why I chose to organize these 12 in the specific way that I did? And my hint to you is you don't need to look very far. Miriam, Donna, anyone else who's still replying to all panelists, please adjust your chat so that we can see your responses. Everybody can, not just me. Again, the question is, why do you think I chose this particular order instead of maybe a more intuitive or instructionally friendly order? Not that this is bad, but it's a little bit perhaps not the way I would present it, if not for the fact that I wanted to accomplish one thing in particular. Okay, it could be from simplicity to complex. Thank you, Miriam. It happens not to be my motivation here, but that is a good instructional idea. And we're actually going to talk about that with one of the strategies soon. Okay, planning versus delivering. So also not my motivation, but thank you, Kelly. And that's also good to be thinking about how do we plan? And then of course, how do we implement? These are actually all on the delivery or implementation side. Okay, some are saying easiest versus hardest. Okay, Hugo, you need to elaborate there because you are warm. All right, I'm not exactly sure what you have in mind there, but if you could elaborate a little bit, and if anyone could see what Hugo wrote, that is going to bring us to the answer to this question, again, from the perspective of me, the one who created this content. So I do recognize that it takes some time to type, especially if you are prone to typos like me. And it also takes time for it to populate in the chat. So I'm going to take the liberty of answering my own question. It could be that you're already working on this, and if you are, I will see it, and I certainly do appreciate it. I simply organized this because in this way, because I was trying to, so Hugo talked about grouping, mental group, active cluster. All right, so I'm still not fully clear on what you're trying to say, but I'll tell you what I have in mind. I was trying to figure out, is there a mnemonic? There we go. It's a mnemonic. Thank you, Kelly. If you look at O, F, G, G, M, A, C, all the way down, and then you look at the right column, you will see that it spells something. Now, I don't know that the word vrooms is spelled correctly, but sometimes you can get away with it if you're trying to accomplish something in your mind. Now, again, 12 isolated strategies, no obvious connection. Yeah, thank you. It is the wrong spelling, but that was, but it's not because I can't spell, Kelly, although that may be true. It's simply because I'm trying to remember all these various things, and I figured, how can I create an sound that still sounds like vroom, which is the what's it called? Which is the sound that a car would make, and kind of capture the idea. So bottom line is, I put it all together and I spelled something. May not be the most sophisticated sentence in the world, but GMAC is I believe they really make auto parts. I don't think that they are a car manufacturer, but they do drive cars, sponsored cars in NASCAR and other races. So I was familiar with it. So I wrote car of GMAC vrooms. Now the car is in parentheses because the car part doesn't represent anything, but the of GMAC's vrooms does. And starting with the word of in this context, I thought would be awkward. So I added the word car. But this way, if you have of GMAC vrooms, that is a single phrase. Now, of course, I still need to remember what does the O stand for, what does the F stand for, and I try to focus very much on the verb of each one. So I didn't talk about any kind of word leading up to a verb. It went right into organize or funnel or grouping, things we actually would do, okay? And that's gonna make it easier for me to remember. But otherwise, if you have 12 disparate pieces of information and you don't connect them in some kind of way, then it's going to be much more difficult to remember it over time. All right, now later as we go through the strategies, I welcome and encourage you to tell me which strategy was I using in this slide as we learn what all these different strategies are. You might even want to take a guess now, it's totally fine, but let's kind of, there are a couple here actually that I think would connect, and thank you, Hugo, for getting us going with that. Okay, now, I wanted to take it to the next level because I thought this might not be enough. Okay, so indulge me, please, as I share with you the following. Okay, one second here. Oh, I must have had it twice. I didn't even realize I had it twice. My apologies. Now you probably see it more clearly. Is that fair? And what's the difference between the two? How did I make it easier for you? The answer is because I emboldened the first letter. That's exactly right, Hassan. I emboldened the first letter, and that just made it easier to see. And boom, there it is. You could see it very clearly. So whatever works for you, now it makes it easy peasy, so to speak. Making it easy to find is important. Making it easy for your brain to access, to codify, to store, and to retrieve. All of these things matter. And if it's a visual, that's going to help you. If you see the word now kind of like going in a vertical fashion, letter over letter, and it spells it out in your mind and you kind of capture it that way, that's great. If you see it horizontally at the bottom and you see the picture of the car, that's great. It doesn't matter to me what works for you. It matters to me that it works. Now, keep in mind, this is very important, I think, that just like with modalities, as we have talked about, different people learn in different ways. So it's not just about what works best for me, the teacher, because I will have my own orientation, my own preferences. It's going to matter with regards to the orientation or the modalities and the needs of your students. And the same is true for retention. So therefore, we can't only rely or assume that if I only have one method, it's going to necessarily work for everybody. So if we have variation, differentiation in how we plan for retention. Again, in the last session we talked about the same way that I've got to plan my lesson. What is the content, the scope and sequence? What am I actually teaching? What am I going to be, how am I going to be teaching it? How much time will I allocate? All of those important questions, what we might call a task analysis. We also have to ask ourselves, how am I going to teach from memory? How am I going to ensure that my students actually remember this? And we have to be thinking about it in a differentiated way, the same way that we plan instruction in a differentiated fashion. I hope that this makes sense. If there are any questions here, go ahead and put them in. If there are no questions, just write "got it" in the chat so I know that we are clear and that I can proceed accordingly. Okay. A bunch of you guys are really quick on the chat and I appreciate it. Thank you for being so responsive, so quick, and so, just being present with me. Now, here is that fun slide that I was referencing. Rather than reading it to you, I'm going to let you read it to yourself. I'm curious if you can figure out what I am trying to accomplish with this in the context, of course, of what we've been talking about until now. Thank you for your comments. I'll continue to look at them, but I'm not going to really comment on them till later. Cheryl, Miriam, you might want to adjust your chat so everybody can see what you're writing. Again, we want it to be set to all panelists and attendees. Okay, some talked about variety, highlighting. I see you now, Miriam, to everybody. Thank you. What else do you see over here? What is the purpose of this variation? Or how could this be better than the previous version for somebody? Okay, it does spell it out. That is true. What else? Okay, so it embeds it in a narrative. See past the fluff. What are the important points? Well, that's true. The bolding does help in that regard. Okay, we see a story, what helped him. Yes. All right, so this is an idea of trying to create, who remembers from last week? Those of you who were here just know their memory in general. What is the kind of memory that we want to create that will be most deeply embedded in our long-term memory? It's a certain kind of memory. It goes beyond working memory. Working memory is actually not part of our long-term memory. It's what kind of keeps the brain, moving information from point to point. So you talk about a narrative. We talked last week about an episodic memory. Now, episodic is based on an episode, something we do. This is a little bit different because the only actor here is John. It's not us. But sometimes when we get into a story, we can frame it as if it's our story. And even if it's not, we often remember stories much better than we remember rote information. So the previous one is rote. The previous one was just some, I believe we called it semantic, if I'm not, unless I'm totally confused here. And it was just rote information by itself. Here we embedded the entire 12 steps into a single story, right? So the story is based on a struggling student who couldn't learn anything. So he did this and then moved into that and then did the next thing, etc. It created a deeper, more interconnected narrative. Just out of curiosity, which of you, let's use the previous slide as 1 and the current slide as 2. So this one is 1 and this one is 2. Please just type the number between 1 and 2 that would work better for you to remember these 12 steps. Please adjust, Sarah, your settings so everybody can see your response. Juanita as well. Okay, so most of you chose 1. I only saw 1, 2. Yeah, so far only 1, 2, and that's totally fine. It may not be worth it for you to go ahead and create something as extensive as this just for, I'm not sure, Hugo, what 3 represents. But for most of you, it sounds like this mnemonic was the simpler one for you, maybe because of the variety and the amount, and maybe because the story wasn't as, maybe not every step is as clearly defined. Some of it is a little bit more creative in nature, grabbing a funnel, like that's, like what exactly is happening over there. But the idea ultimately is that if you offer, excuse me, different ways for students to remember things, you are helping them remember it better. Okay. And let's actually go to one last one. This is now number 3. Maybe Hugo was just imagining what was coming next, being a little prophetic there. I'm not sure. So can anyone tell me what this is? It's sort of an infographic, but as Hassan points out, it's a visualization of the concepts. So let's go in the order over here. We're starting with the top left, and we're going to move across and then back down to the left and across and back down again until we get to the bottom. Okay, so let's start on the top left. Picture memory. Yeah, so what's the top one? Let's see if I can quickly grab one of these guys. All right, so I'm going to spotlight this thing. Let's sort of hover over. Do you see this red indicator here that I'm moving around with? So let's focus on this one first. What is this one over here? Which step? Okay, so you raised your hand. I'm assuming that means you could see it. This is, we talked about organizing information. If it's organized, I'm going to remember it better. What is this one? This is the funnel. That's correct. Okay, and then we have the glue. Okay, so that means we want to make it sticky. We'll talk about that more. And then we take it and we create groups. How do we organize information in a manner that makes it easy to group together? You might group by anything from age and gender to area code to geographics to time in history. There's so many different ways by which to group things. This is the cluster. Okay, now what is this one over here? When we talk about memory, who remembers this one? The girl in the green shirt, and she's looking up and she's visualizing, right? So you want to create a visual memory, have them tap into that. Now, what do you think is happening here between our 2 bird friends? They're repeating it often. Very good. Thank you, Kelly. And then that leads to, typically, after you recite it and you repeat it, let's go back here. So let's go to our story for just a moment before we continue. John was struggling to hold on to the information that he was learning in school. So that's John, right? Here's John. He's not a happy camper. Work is difficult. So what does he do? He gets some advice from his teacher. His teacher told him to try organizing and ordering it that we have over, sorry, this way that we have over here. And of course we have it over here too, but either way, I don't want to jump too much over here. John wasn't sure how to do that. So he grabbed a funnel, which is the funnel approach, which means you go from big to small, from large idea, from macro to micro, and some glue, which refers to mental glue, and decided he was going to group together everything that he learned. Now, was that good over here? Did we do a good job with that? So we grouped it together. And then we have, this one doesn't really represent, at least in the story for the moment, but we'll come back to it soon. Sorry about that. This was an active process. Okay, he used a web to cluster all together. That was the web that you saw before, so that he could visualize it. So let's go to that. That's the web. Here's the visualization. And now what comes next, sorry, he also recited it aloud. That means you're saying it again and again. Doing this helped him to achieve clarity, and now we're over here, clarity and understanding. So let's focus now on the last few, starting down here in the bottom left. This one is too. Even when you understand it and you have clarity, it is worthwhile to go ahead and overlearn. Because when you overlearn, thank you, Kelly and Sherry, and for others who are contributing over here, right? When you overlearn, you hold it deeper. You know, the Talmud actually says that there is no comparison between reviewing something for 100th time versus 101. And those numbers have actual significance, but I'm not going to get into that right now. When you overlearn, you drive it deeper into your memory, you hold on to it longer, and of course, you remember it better. This Holmes over here for the 5 Great Lakes is an example of a mnemonic. And then you also want to put things to song wherever you can. Mnemonic is one of the hardest words to spell. So everybody give it a shot and do not worry, because it's really not our focus right now. And then the last one, like I said, is the music piece. And that's a critical component as well, because whenever we can put it to music, to poetry, things that will help us remember it better. As I think I shared with you, even in the last session, I had students who remembered relatively, what's the word I'm looking for? I wouldn't say irrelevant, but definitely not common knowledge, historical knowledge about names and where they belonged in certain groups or whatever it was. But because I connected it using song, they remembered it later. And of course, what is the outcome of all of this? John is now a very happy and successful student. So let's keep that in mind as we do all of our instruction, that we want to be focusing on memory at all times. Okay, I'm going to click out of this if I can. Not sure that I can. Looks like I might be stuck with it, but let's see if there's a way. Okay, maybe if I do this, it'll stop. Let's see. Yeah, it looks like it stopped. Okay, any comments or questions here before we move on? So I'm going to assume the answer to be no for now, and we're going to jump in with our strategies. Okay, so as a reminder, the way we're going to measure success in this presentation is I'm going to ask you collectively to help me re-list the 12 different strategies, as well as share applications for your personal classroom. Okay. Right. Okay. So let's stay here and let's keep going. So the first thing we want to do is help students organize and order their information. Right? That'll help them store it. It'll help them retrieve it. And if you store it better, it'll be easier and more correct on the retrieval side of things. And one great way to do this is by using graphic organizers. Now, I'm not going to go deep on graphic organizers today. I have discussed them in the past. Certainly not the only way to do that, but it is a very useful tool. So if you are using graphic organizers, do recognize that you're not only differentiating and helping with different modalities and all of that, you are also helping your students remember it better, because the information has a place to go, and so your brain has a more natural place where to store it. Okay, that is number one. If you want to talk about, by the way, in the comments, a particular graphic organizer that is your go-to, something that you like to reference a lot, please go ahead and do that. I believe we've used a KWL together in the past. There's a bunch of other ones as well, but I don't want to start talking about all of them. I'd love to see what you might be using in your classroom that give your students an opportunity to organize information in a clear manner. So go ahead and include that. I will be looking for it. But in the meantime, I'm going to be moving forward because we have a lot still to do. Number 2 is the funnel approach, which basically means start large and then get into the details afterwards. So once the general concepts are understood, the details make more sense and fit into a neat and clear place. So just like a funnel starts wide at the top and gets narrower and kind of like gets narrow and everything sort of filters down that way, the same is true for information. Go big at the beginning, get them clear, help them see, let's say if you're teaching a historical period, maybe give them the macro big picture version of what happens in this era, and then break it down for them further, maybe by big events or by blocks of time or some other criteria. If you're talking about a story, you want to teach them a story, but you don't necessarily want them, you may not want to spoil it, but you might still want to tell them that the story is comprised of these 4 or 5 larger subcomponents and give them a sense of what's coming, or maybe mathematical concepts, and then you drill down more deeply over time. All of these are places where funnel could work, but I think it's most useful when you're dealing with rote detail, what we almost might call minutia, and trying to help students find a place for it. Okay, chunking, similar concepts or related ideas. Let's take a look at chunking. Here is a brief quiz. We'll call it an exercise to minimize stress. Okay, but here's an exercise that I'd like for you to do. So read all of the words on the bottom of the page, starting with the word skiing. And then when you're done, I'm going to ask you to write down as many of them as you can without looking back at the list. Okay? So we're going to start this very shortly. I'm going to give you a few more moments with me not talking to read it. And then it's going to be exercise/quiz time. So I hope you have a pen available. And I'm going to ask you when we're done how many you got in the time that I gave you, starting in 15 seconds. Okay, and now we begin. Oops, I guess I'm just going to move it elsewhere for a moment. Please write down as many of those sports that you can remember as possible. Ten more seconds. You don't have to use the chat. You can if you wish to. But right now, you should not be looking at the screen, the chat, unless it helps you. Right now, focus, please, on just writing down as many as you can. And when you're done, please tally the number of how many you remembered. Okay, I'm about to go back to that slide so that you can all see it. And please tell me your numbers. You will see that in total, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. They're about 20. Could be I'm off by 1 here or there, but they're about 20. And some of you are recording numbers as high as 12, which is pretty good. I don't think I get more than like 5 or 6. Now, it's very clear to me that I do not have here the slides that I was thinking I would have for this particular exercise. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to see if I can quickly pull up what I think would be the slide that I'm imagining here. Let me try to see if I can grab that for a moment and see if that in fact doesn't have the information that I was looking for. Bear with me for just a second. No, that one doesn't have it either. That is so weird. Okay, I'm pretty sure that I did this differently where I could present to you this whole thing visually, and it's not here. Maybe it's this one. Bear with me for just another moment, if you don't mind. Okay, Kelly, I think you're on the right track here. Yeah, oh, so here it is, here it is, here it is. Okay, so let me get into presentation. I'm gonna shift the screen share on this for the moment. I might switch back, I might not. I think I will switch back, but let's try to go to this one. Okay, do you now see a different screen? Just confirming you see a different screen. Here's the same one you saw before, is that correct? Okay, so now take a look at it this way. What if I gave you the information and I asked you to drop it in accordingly? How much easier would that make it for you? Yeah, so it would make it much easier. So all you're doing now, what is the technique we're doing here? What have I done for you? By giving you, yes, there's a graphic organizer, but what have I done for you? Right, we break it down, we sort it, we organize it, we group it, we create associations. Excellent. These are all wonderful pieces of information and exactly where I was looking to go with it. So I'm actually going to stay with this PowerPoint for now because it's kind of working. But if I see that it has either too much information or whatever it is, because I really worked off the other one. So this is one of those teaching in the moments. But I wanted you to see this and I didn't have it for some reason in the other slide. Okay, so that was number three. Number three, we talked about grouping concepts or ideas or types of sports together. Now let's talk about increasing retention through mental glue. Now, does anyone know what the word tawdry means? T-A-W-D-R-Y, tawdry. And you may not look it up, at least not now. T-A-W-D-R-Y. Does anyone know what that means? So while you're thinking about responding, let me reference the first couple of bullets over here. We often remember things based on a mental path. So it could be the kind of clothing that you're wearing. It could be a place where something occurs or a particular kind of action. You might remember things based on smell. You might remember things, I think I mentioned in a previous presentation, that when I get off the highway, I often remember to call somebody back because I was on a call with them the last time I got off that exit in that particular spot on the highway. Or you see certain clothing. I shared with you the presenter the last time from Peoria who wore the same outfit as a way of becoming a retrieval cue, right? She wanted people to see her, and by seeing her, remember the information that she taught because they associate the information with the clothing she was wearing. Okay, making information personally relevant or meaningful to you. The more you can make it meaningful, the more you can kind of like internalize it first person, this kind of thing, the better it's going to be. That's one of the reasons I wanted to use the John story to make it meaningful, because many students could associate with John. Many students could say, oh, that's me, or that used to be me, or that's my brother, or that's my cousin, or that's my friend, right? So they can associate the person, and by connecting with the person, they connect to the story, they connect to the information. Now, for number three, this is where my tawdry question comes in. Miriam and Kelly, you were both correct. Not good quality, somewhat gaudy. The definition in my 7th grade vocabulary book, because this is where I remember learning it, is as follows, and I quote verbatim: showy and flashy, but lacking in good taste. So something very showy, something that people will notice, but they look at it and they say, ah, that's not very nice. It's not very pleasing. Okay, now, how do I remember that today? The answer is because I created some mental glue for myself, not even knowing what that was. Back in 7th grade, I took the TAW of tawdry, I flipped it around and spelled WAT, which were the first 3 letters of the 5-letter word water, and DRY, which is the back half of tawdry, became dry. I thought of water and dry as in dry cleaners, somebody going to wash clothing, but the kind of clothing that they were washing was not of the stately and refined version. It was the tawdry, it was the showy and flashy kind. Okay, so I remembered it as an association with the words water and dry that connected me with dry cleaning and cleaning in general, which is clothing, et cetera, et cetera. So your brain can work in a variety of ways. They could be logical or they could be silly. It doesn't matter. You want to make sure that it works. So we talked about homes before as a mnemonic for the Great Lakes. Maybe you remember people building homes, sorry, all alongside the Great Lakes. So if you live in Chicago, for example, you know that Lake Michigan is right off of, or downtown Chicago, and much of Chicago, frankly, for that matter, is right off of Lake Michigan. And so you remember, you think of the buildings and the houses, sorry about that are built all alongside the lake. And that would be just another way to remember that acronym, okay? And sometimes you can create a narrative. The stranger the story, the easier it'll be to remember, okay? So I hope you're all thinking of mental glue examples, things that you use or things that you can use to make information sticky and that they can find it and retrieve it at the right time. Sometimes you'll use like a memory model where you start with a common word, whether that's a color like it is in this case, or a place or something else, and you kind of build out all of these different components that share something foundational to the word in the center. So maybe you have, for example, a vocabulary list you want your students to learn, and there's a word or two in there that serves as a good link maybe to a bunch of the others, maybe not all of them, but maybe a lot of them. And you ask your students to create a semantic memory model for the purpose of remembering those vocabulary words, or maybe for remembering details in a story or something similar to this. If you have particular uses for this kind of graphic organizer, this kind of model that I didn't reference, or even if I did, feel free to share it so that we could see how you might use something like this, okay? So this is a place that I would do this live, right? Let's say, for example, I wanted to learn everybody's names around this conversation, or maybe you go into school on the first day and the kids don't know each other. So if you're in a high school freshman class, this is probably a pretty good place where you could be doing this, assuming that your high school is not a feeder from the elementary. But either way, the point is that let's say you have a lot of unfamiliar classmates, so you give them something about their name, right? It could be that you look at their last name and there's something about it, or the way that they look reminds you of something. And then, so for example, let's say somebody's last name is Smith, or somebody's last name is Jones, or whatever that might be. What are some words or ideas that you could associate with the name that will remind you of that person at a later point? Okay, once you have a few different ideas, you can think of the associations that could be combined to remember the name. And you kind of do this. This is a great networking technique. It's just a good way to remember information that otherwise is hard to hold on to. You're asking people, I don't know any of you, and I want to remember all of you kind of like at the same time. That's not an easy thing to do. But if you can identify ways by which to associate, their names with certain visuals. So Smith, you might think of a what's the word I'm looking for? Like a metalsmith, like a blacksmith, for example. Or you might think of something similar to that. And then maybe the first name is Ken, or the first name is Judy, or whatever that might be. And then you make an association between that first name, whatever that reminds you of, and the blacksmith doing something. Then boom, you have that visual. And now you remember the person's name is Judy Goldsmith, or Judy Smith, sorry. Okay, in this particular case. All right, I hope that was at least somewhat helpful in imagining how to utilize this. All right, as we continue through our list over here, I am being mindful of time. And for those of you who need to go before the, at the end of the hour, that's totally fine. We'll continue, like I said, a little bit longer, and that's okay. There will be a recording sent via email for anyone who misses any portion of it, wants to go back and see it. All of that is good. Okay, active learning, pretty straightforward. The more I'm mentally in the game, the more I will remember things. So helping students be active learners, encouraging their responses, encouraging their participation, encouraging them to work and do, that's going to help the process. Miriam, it's been a pleasure having you here. Thank you so much for all of your contributions. Clustering and webbing. So sometimes ideas are not linear in nature, but you can still associate them. It's similar to what we talked about before with the semantic mental model, but it's the idea of bringing different things together in a way where you could see it and you create a picture. And when you have a picture in your mind, especially the visual learners, they will see it all in front of them. They'll be able to grab it because you put it visually in one common space. Okay, Again, as we move through these, I'm assuming that they're relatively straightforward, and I apologize if more depth is required in some cases. But again, in the interest of time, I'm trying to make sure that we move through all of them and get time for our video reminders, or video reviews, I should call them, because there are two. Okay, visual memory. So associating concepts with pictures. Anything you do with diagrams, tables, outlines, pictures, cartoons, etc., those will help your students remember, especially your visual learners. Even things that are text only, like vocabulary words or algebraic formulas, try to create a visual representation of it so that the students can see it, see how it looks on the page, and remember it from that picture orientation. Recite the information aloud, say it, repeat it again and again. Peer teach, right? Oftentimes, not only will it help clarify, which is critical, because this is the story I think I referenced last week, but I'm not sure I shared the whole thing. When I was about 9 years old, for those of you who are a little bit older and are familiar with professional basketball, you might be familiar with the person who was born Lou Alcindor and became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar over time and played professionally for many years as an All-Star and Hall of Famer. And so one year he led the league in scoring, sometime in the late 70s. And the book just included, the book that I was reading in school that had all this NBA statistics and information, only included the last name of the player and whatever, numbers were there. And I remember as a kid reading Abdul Jabab instead of Abdul Jabbar. I know it sounds like a small difference. And I thought it was the funniest name I've ever heard. I'm walking around school, Abdul Jabab, thinking it's like, hysterical. And I come home, and my mother, of all people, told me, I think his name is Abdul Jabbar. And I remember that experience. I remember learning it wrong. And I remember that I needed to relearn it and get it correct. So whenever students mislearn, they need to forget, so to speak, and relearn. So the better it is at the beginning, the easier it'll be for them to remember on the back end. And if you look at the pyramid down below, you will see that if I just lecture, they're going to remember very little. The more that we do to engage the students in the learning process, with the highest level being teaching each other, that's where the highest level of retention occurs. And you probably can speak to that point because you probably remember things you teach more than you remember other information. So if you can get your students to teach, now you're really in business. Okay, here's some statistics. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you see quickly that as time progresses via number of days, when students don't review, the drop-off of memory is significant. I think these numbers are even pretty high for a student that doesn't review 7 days later. That's not, they probably remember even less based on other data that I've seen, but even so, you see that there's a huge drop-off. But students who are reviewing, even many, many weeks later, you will see that they remember a significant amount of information. And the way that we do that is not to try to review everything every day, because there's no way we can make that happen. But what we want to do is we want to create a process by which the review occurs. I'll show you that in a moment. First, you see another visualization. A lot is forgotten right away. Within a month, almost everything is forgotten. Right? We can't assume that just because we taught it, they're automatically going to remember it. However, if they spend a lot of time reviewing on day one and then smaller increments of review over a series of days, less and less over time, they will still hold on to most of the information because you've created the pathway. It's very clear. It's like an open road. There's no encumbrances. My mind is constantly accessing that information, and hence I will remember it. In fact, I remember a story involving a rabbi who was considered to be a person of great memory, supposed to have great capacity for memory. And another rabbi quipped, he said, he doesn't have a great memory. He just relearned it, again yesterday. The idea being constantly reviewing that information. And so he didn't need to remember it per se, but he's constantly learning it and learning it and learning it. And that was his way. So whether that was a joke or whether that was real, the bottom line is we know as a fact that the more you review, for less and less time over time, the more you will remember. So let's keep that in mind. Okay. And no, don't just say, well, I got it. Or your students will sometimes say, I know it. I don't need to learn it. Encourage them to overlearn the information. Tell them that there's an actual benefit Tell them that if they just go a little bit beyond mastery, it's going to engrave the information very deeply in their minds and in their memories. So they hold on to it for much, much longer, and they'll use that information as the basis for learning new things. So tell them the benefits, make those really clear, and help them understand how their minds work. Because the more that you demystify the learning process, the more that they will buy in and work with you to remember better. Okay, so let's see over here, right? We want to work towards understanding, which is number 10, which is you want to have them recite the information using their own words. This is the second level, by the way, of Bloom's taxonomy. So we've talked about this before, right? Ask the students, have the students ask for clarity. You ask them, to repeat what they heard, and make sure that they get it right the first time. Because as we talked about before, if they get it wrong and they misunderstand it, they'll have to unlearn and relearn, which we don't want to do. Okay, and then the last two are the mnemonic devices and songs that we referenced before. So as I move into the next slide, I'm going to ask you to please put into the chat which of these tools are you or are you planning on using in an upcoming lesson plan so that we can answer number 2. And I'm also going to use that as the basis by which we answer number 1. So hopefully in the aggregate, we will get all 12 listed, all the 12 different strategies listed here in the chat, as well as the ones that you are planning to specifically apply to your classroom. And if you need me to put that back up on the screen, I'm happy to do it. We'll have to scroll a little bit, but that is okay. Because in the grand scheme of things, we want to make sure that everybody is using it. So I don't see any responses yet. And I'm going to move now to the other, PowerPoint, because I want to show you some things that are not here. We'll keep the other piece going for now. Bear with me for a moment. I think it's this one. Okay, let me share that with you, and let's now get us to where we were before. Oh, I didn't even include the 1-minute paper component. Okay, cool. All right, we'll have to leave that for now. That's just a way of deepening student learning, but we don't have time to go further. I do want to get here. So I'm going to, while I'm looking for your responses, I'm also going to play this short review video with you. And I'm going to, let's see, a share computer sound. Hopefully you can hear this.
Take a moment and try to remember what you were doing last week. Chances are you can remember the general idea of the things you did, the people you saw, but unless you really put effort to encode that information into your long-term memory, you might not remember specifics. However, it's sometimes really important that we remember specific information. So we're going to talk today about encoding strategies and why they can help you learn. Encoding is just the act of moving information from the temporary store in your working memory into the permanent store in your long-term memory. Working memory is where you process anything that you're thinking about right at this moment. However, it has a limited capacity. It can only hold 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information at a time. If you want to remember more than 7 things, you're going to need to process that information in a way that makes sure it gets into and stays in long-term memory so that you can retrieve it later. So the first technique I want to tell you about is rote rehearsal. And this is what everybody does, but unfortunately it's the least effective encoding technique. What rote rehearsal is, it just means you say the same thing over and over again. So like you get introduced to someone at a party and they tell you their name is Bob and you say, okay, I'm going to remember this person's name by just thinking about it and saying it over and over, Bob, Bob, Bob. And if you've ever tried this, you know it's probably not effective because after you actually have a conversation with this person and you're not thinking about their name for a while, you try to remember it later and you can't. The reason for that is that rote rehearsal is not really an effortful technique. It doesn't require you to process the information. You just have to repeat it over and over. So there's nothing that your brain is doing to get it into long-term memory. Successful encoding techniques usually involve tying in the new information into previously known information. And one way to do this is called chunking. And by chunking, we actually group the information that we're getting into meaningful units. So this ties it into maybe meaningful categories that we already know. So for example, let me give you a grocery list, just a list of items that you'll need to go get at the store and you have to remember them. So listen to these items and then I'll ask you about them. We have bananas, oranges, blueberries, bread, rice, chicken, peanuts, baking soda, flour, eggs, butter. All right, so those are the items you're gonna have to go get at the store. Just take a second to think of or write down all the items from that list that you can remember. Okay, so there were 11 items on the list. How'd you do? If you recognize that those items were in categories, we have bananas, oranges, and blueberries with fruits, bread and rice, carby, bready things, chicken and peanuts, proteins, baking soda, flour, eggs, butter, baking items. If you recognize those categories, those 11 items became very easy because they were in 4 sets of familiar categories. If you tried to do rote rehearsal and just repeat those items in order over and over, that probably wasn't very helpful and you probably didn't get as many as you could have. So that's chunking, and it's really helpful when items lend themselves to be grouped in categories or chunked together in a certain way. And what's cool is you can chunk them in a way however it makes sense to you. And you might even have chunked those items differently, put them into different categories, and that's totally fine. As long as the categories make sense to you and those chunks will be retrievable, then that's great. Another encoding technique involves mnemonic devices. And these are memory aids that help you link what you're trying to learn into previously existing, easier to remember information that's probably already in long-term memory. One mnemonic device is imagery, and you might even use this already. It's just creating a vivid mental picture of whatever it is you're trying to remember. So if we go back to our grocery list of bananas, oranges, and blueberries, and we start with that, you can imagine yourself vividly walking through the store, but really the crazier the images, the more likely you are to remember it. So maybe you picture a big banana who's wearing an orange for a hat and he's juggling blueberries. So that kind of links it into familiar activities or shapes, but you're also creating this unique combination of those items. The next 2 mnemonic devices are really good if you need to remember something in order, so a sequence of items. And those are called the peg word system and the method of loci. Both of those really just involve making anchors and linking your new information to those anchors along a specific path. For example, the peg word system is more verbal anchors. So you start with words that rhyme with the number. So you say 1 is a gun, 2 is a shoe, 3 is a tree, and so forth and so on. And you have that set list. And say we need to get our grocery items in certain order, and we can use our peg word system to remember that. So we have 1 is a gun, and our first item is bananas. So we might say, okay, there's a gun, and it looks like a banana. So we have our banana gun, and he's shooting at an orange, hiding behind a shoe. And then the orange rolls away and rolls up a tree where he finds blueberries hanging there. And really by doing that, you've combined imagery with the peg word system. And the more mnemonic techniques you can use, the more encoding techniques overall, the greater the likelihood that you'll remember this information later. The method of loci is really similar to the peg word system, except it involves using locations instead of verbal anchors. So maybe if you have a familiar walking route or bus route or anything, then you can tie the information that you need to remember to certain stops along that route. So like maybe there's bananas raining down at the bus stop I get on, and then in the next stop an orange rolls onto the bus. And the next stop I see a cat with a blueberry hat or something like that. So again, we're combining a couple mnemonic techniques, which is awesome, and we're connecting information that we already know, such as a familiar route, to the new information that we want to learn. The last mnemonic technique I want to tell you about is an acronym. And this is when one letter of a familiar word stands for the first letter of the new information. So like a really popular one is the acronym HOMES for the Great Lakes in the US. We have H stands for Huron, O, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, and Superior. So we have this easy to remember familiar word, HOMES, and then we can use those letters as cues to remember what we want. That one's kind of fun because you can make up your own acronyms and those can be really memorable. So moving on into increasingly useful encoding techniques, self-referencing is really great. This is just when you think about the new information and how it relates to you personally. So if you're trying to learn something about history, you might imagine yourself talking to the general or marching into battle with the troops or anything about how the information relates to you and how you could use it. That involves a great deal of deep processing, and it makes it more likely that you'll be able to retain that information. And kind of related to self-referencing is the idea of preparing to teach. This means that you imagine that you are learning this material in order to teach it to someone else. When that happens, you're actually able to remember it a lot better because you're putting a lot more effort into organizing and understanding the information you're taking in. The last technique I want to tell you about is spacing. So this is a little bit different than the other ones. The other techniques involve what you do while you're already studying, but spacing involves how you structure that studying. Spacing means that you should spread out your study sessions over time rather than cramming them all into one massive study session. This is kind of unintuitive because a lot of people think that if you have 5 hours to study, then you should do it all at once right before the test so that it's fresh in your mind to take the test. Right? We've all done that. But what researchers have found is that if you actually space out your study sessions, so if you have 5 1-hour study sessions across 5 days, you will actually remember that information long term a lot better. And this is unintuitive because if you're studying something for an hour and then you start your second hour, all that information feels really fluent. You're like, yeah, I've got this. I'm really on top of it. But if you study for an hour, wait a day, and then you start your second hour, it feels a lot harder and you realize that you don't know it as well as you thought you did. So one reason spacing is thought to be helpful is because it lets you know what you don't know while you're studying, and it also introduces kind of a form of self-testing, so you're able to prepare yourself better for that later test. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list of all the encoding techniques in the world, but it is a lot of the more common and more useful ones. And what you might have noticed about the effective encoding techniques is that they do involve a little extra effort, but hopefully now in your studying you can be prepared to process the information in a productive way so that you can study efficiently and effectively. Good luck!
Okay, so I wanted first of all to acknowledge all of you who replied earlier on with the various techniques you're going to be using and how you're going to integrate them into your classrooms. Very much appreciate it all. For anyone who has been asking about recordings, there will be an email going out tomorrow with a recording of this session. I will also link up the last session for anyone who did not get that and wants to be able to find it, or you could just go to my YouTube channel where it already is posted, and I will share that one more
Rehearsal
time.
is, it just
Oh, sorry
means you
about
say the
that.
same
I will
thing.
share that one more time in the link here in the chat so everybody can find it and go there. Okay, I think I'm going to wrap it up over here and not go to this last presentation just because time is already over and it will just take us that much further. But I want to thank you all for being here. I don't know that I'm going to be doing another webinar for the next couple of weeks because I just have to be able to focus on some other things. We have some holidays coming up. Memorial Day, there's a holiday, a Jewish holiday that I'll be celebrating. So unless you hear otherwise from me, we're probably putting this on hold until the end of May and looking again out at the beginning of June to see if it makes sense to start up at this time. In the meantime, be looking out for your inbox for articles and other posts that I have that are helpful for not only educators, but people in general. Hopefully we can continue to find ways to become better acquainted, to learn from one another. And I did want to mention as well, if there still are any school leaders on this call, I am in the process. I don't know that I'm going to be doing one for teachers right now. I had thought about it, but I didn't get a great response to it. However, the school leader piece is very much in play. If anybody is interested as a school leader, either present or aspiring, and wants to be part of a mastermind group to really scale up in your professional practice, please take a minute, complete this form, give me some information as well as whether or not you want me to reach out to you. And if you do, we will have a conversation and see if this is a good fit for you at this time. Otherwise, wishing you all a wonderful day. Continue to stay safe and well. And I look forward to connecting with you in some format moving forward. Otherwise, thanks again for joining me today and have a blessed day.